Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture. Albion Never Dies. This week I'm looking at British sci-fi, a topic suggested to me some time ago by the gentleman with the Instagram account Is He Ready Goes Bond. He suggested I did British sci-fi, and I was able to cover it a little bit in the episode that pertained to, which was my listener Q&A episode 156. But because I'd received so many questions, I was only able to cover it very, very briefly, and as someone who's a bit of a sci-fi fan, I knew that there was so much more material. So, first of all, I'd start off with, what is sci-fi? Happily, there's a much clearer answer to that than the question, what is Britishness? Sci-fi, according to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, is a form of fiction that deals principally with the impact of actual or imagined science upon society or individuals. That first bit of the definition is why many people say that Star Wars is not science fiction, because of course it's all about the Jedi, the Sith, the Force. It's fantasy. It's, more to do with sorcery than science, whereas classic sci-fi is here's a technology, here's how it goes terribly, terribly wrong, and hopefully here's how we overcome it, unless it's a particularly pessimistic dystopian sci-fi. Anyway, the Encyclopaedia Britannica continues with their definition. The term science fiction was popularised, if not invented, in the 1920s by one of the genre's principal advocates, the American publisher Hugo Gernsback. I just pause here to say I always find it really interesting. I study what is Britishness, but of course I've lived in Turkey and China. I've worked in Saudi Arabia and Oman, and of course I spent 7 years in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. So I'm always really interested in not just British culture, but how it relates to others. So here I have to give recognition that it was the Americans who really gave recognition to this genre, sci-fi, and of course you have the great French writer Jules Verne. Anyway, Hugo Gernsback is why we have the Hugo Awards, given annually since 1953 by the World's Science Fiction Society, named after him. These achievement awards are given to the top sci-fi writers, editors, illustrators, films, and fanzines. Indeed, it's top Hugo Award winners who have written the Star Wars spin-off books back in the 1990s, which I particularly like. But anyway, let's get to the Britishness of it. I think it would be difficult not to start with the great H.G. Wells, the man who wrote The Time Machine, published in 1895, The Island of Dr. Moreau, published the next year, 1896, The Invisible Man, 1897, and The War of the Worlds the same year. A very, very productive man. The War of the Worlds was serialised first in the UK, but I believe it was published first in 1897 in the United States as one book. Fairly common at the time to serialise fiction. Wells, H.G. Wells, was the son of a domestic servant turned small shopkeeper. He grew up under continual threat of poverty, no joke, in the late Victorian era, and at the age of 14, after a very inadequate education supplemented by his inexhaustible love of reading, he was apprenticed to a draper in Windsor. His employer soon dismissed him, and he became an assistant to a chemist, then to another draper, then finally in 1883 an usher at Midhurst Grammar School. At 18, he won a scholarship to study biology at the Normal School, later the Royal College of Science in South Kensington, where T.H. Huxley was one of his teachers. I will, of course, be referring to another Huxley later on. He graduated from London University in 1888, becoming a science teacher and undergoing a period of ill health and financial worries, the latter aggravated by his marriage in 1891 to his cousin, Isabel Mary Wells. The marriage was not a success, and in 1894 Wells ran off with Amy Catherine Robbins, who died in 1927, a former pupil who in 1895 became his second wife. A very tumultuous private life, but fascinating how H.G. Wells' talent was able to come out. And of course, with The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds, and many more, it's fascinating how he really coined this idea of Martians and popularised this idea of Martians battling humanity. He had a tremendous influence on sci-fi, even until the Tom Cruise era. There's also an argument that The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published in 1886, is kind of a science fiction story, but it's also a mystery and a gothic horror. Of course, written by Robert Louis Stevenson of Treasure Island fame. So he was a very popular writer. Again, I think it's difficult not to see the influence. I said I'd talk about another Huxley, Aldous Huxley, of course, born in 1829 in Godalming, in Surrey, south of England. Died in November 22nd, 1963 in Los Angeles, California. He's an English novelist and critic gifted with an acute and far-ranging intelligence whose works are notable for their wit and pessimistic satire. He's best known for just one novel, Brave New World, published in 1932. It's been a model for much dystopian sci-fi ever since. For example, George Lucas's first sci-fi film was not Star Wars. His first one was THX 1138, and there's one of the much longer series of letters and numbers all jumbled up, which was his student film. But this was a very, very serious commentary on modern society, because after all, so at the beginning, sci-fi often takes a new technology and considers how it might affect society, and often that puts it into the present day. So 60s sci-fi can look very, very 60s, 70s sci-fi can look very, very 70s, because they're taking the trends of the time and taking them to the nth degree. So THX is pretty focused on 70s trends and kind of the fear of consumerism and indeed drugs and control. So it's a really interesting piece, and particularly it gives context to George Lucas's friend saying, well, you can make this kind of artistic stuff that makes no money, but could you make a family-friendly movie that would make money? Anyway, that's, for me, the biggest offshoot. I've read The Brave New World, I think, a couple of times, and I must admit, it's not my kind of thing, but it's interesting to see, written in 1932, how influential it would later become. And of course, Aldous Huxley himself, having been educated at Eton and Oxford, is very much a pillar of Britishness, although he would live much of his life in Italy, and as I mentioned, the end of his life was in California. One sci-fi which I actually learned about this week is called The Fixed Period by Anthony Trollope. I never thought of Anthony Trollope as a sci-fi writer, but apparently he did try his hand at it, and I learned this through the podcast No Such Thing as a Fish. No Such Thing as a Fish are the QILs, the people who set the TV quiz. They have a podcast. If you wonder what podcast does a podcaster listen to, it's No Such Thing as a Fish. So they talked about this, but they were very interested in the fact that Anthony Trollope published this anonymously. And they talk about Trollope and his life generally. And I kind of thought, hold up, they haven't really talked about this sci-fi written in 1882, set in the far, far future of 1980. So I went online and thought, well, it's out of copyright, isn't it? It should be 70 years after the author's death, and I found a version from Project Gutenberg, who had, well, the full text. So I'm going to read out the first part of it, just as a bit of very, very classic sci-fi, as I say, first published in Blackwood's magazine in 1882. It may be doubted whether a brighter, more prosperous, and specially a more orderly colony than Britannula was ever settled by British colonists. But it had its period of separation from the mother country, though never of rebellion. Like its elder sister, New Zealand. Indeed, in that respect, it simply followed the lead given her by the Australians, which, when they set up for themselves, did so with the full cooperation of England. There was, no doubt, a special cause with us, which did not exist in Australia, and which was only in part understood by the British government, when we Britannulists were allowed to stand by ourselves. The great doctrine of a, quote, fixed period, end quote, was received at first with ridicule by them, and then with dismay, but it was undoubtedly the strong faith which we of Britannula had in that doctrine which induced our separation. Nothing could have been more successful than our efforts to live alone during the 30 years that we remained our own masters. We repudiated no debt, as we have done some of our neighbours, and no attempts have been made towards communism, as has been the case with others. We have been laborious, contented, and prosperous. And if we have been reabsorbed by the mother country in accordance with what I cannot but call the pusillanimous conduct of certain of our elder Britannulists, it has not been from any failure on the part of the island, but from the opposition with which the Fixed Period has been regarded. I think I must begin my story by explaining in moderate language a few of the manifest advantages which would attend the adoption of the Fixed Period in all countries. As far as the law went, it was adopted in Britannula. Its adoption was the first thing discussed by our young assembly when we found ourselves alone. And though there were disputes on the subject, in none of them was opposition made to the system. I myself, at the age of 30, had been elected Speaker of that Parliament, but I was, nevertheless, able to discuss the merits of the bills in committee, and I did so with some enthusiasm. 30 years have passed since, and my, quote, period, quote, is drawing nigh. But I am still as energetic as ever, and as assured that the doctrine will ultimately prevail over the face of the civilized world, though I will acknowledge that men are not as yet ripe for it. The Fixed Period has been so far discussed as to make it almost unnecessary for me to explain its tenets, though its advantages may require a few words of argument in a world that is at present dead to its charms. It consists altogether of the abolition of the miseries, weakness, and imbecility of old age by the prearranged ceasing to live of those who had otherwise become old. Need I explain to the inhabitants of England, for whom I chiefly write, how extreme are those sufferings, and how great the costliness of that old age which is unable in any degree to supply its own wants? Such old age should not, we Britannulists maintain, be allowed to be. This should be prevented in the interests of both the young and of those who do become old when obliged to linger on after their period of work is over. Two mistakes have been made by mankind in reference to their own race. First, in allowing the world to be burdened with the continued maintenance of those whose cares should have been made to cease, and whose troubles should be at an end. Does not the psalmist say the same? If, by reason of strength, they be 80 years, yet is their strength labour and sorrow. And the second, in requiring those who remain to live a useless and painful life. Both these errors have come from an ill-judged and thoughtless tenderness, a tenderness to the young in not calling upon them to provide for decent and comfortable departure of their progenitors, and a tenderness to the old lest the man, when uninstructed and unconscious of good and evil, should be unwilling to leave the world for which he is not fitted. But such tenderness is no better than unpardonable weakness. Statistics have told us that the sufficient sustenance of an old man is more costly than the feeding of a young one, as is also the care, nourishment, and education of the as yet unprofitable child. Statistics have also told us that the unprofitable young and the no less unprofitable old form a third of the population. Let the reader think of the burden with which the labour of the world is thus saddled. To these are to be added all who, because of illness, cannot work, and because of idleness will not. How are people to thrive when so weighted, and for what good? As for the children, they are clearly necessary. They have to be nourished in order that they may do good work as their time shall come. But for those good are the old an effect to be maintained amid all these troubles and miseries? It is, of course, arguing that at the age of 65 we must all go. It's an interesting bit of sci-fi, and of course, the author, Anthony Trollope, was a British civil servant. I think there's an element of satire in this, just as in the 1990s the BBC had a comedy series similarly based, in which everyone had to take the paradise pill at 65, but occasionally there were those who refused it and fought against the established order, terrorising people, and so they became known as the Old Age Paramilitaries, the OAPs, who feared nothing as they fought against this paradise pill. As I say, this is a sci-fi, British sci-fi, that I knew nothing about until another podcast, No Such Thing as a Fish, mentioned it. So I couldn't resist diving into it, and I have to say I'm quite taken with it and might continue my reading. Terrible the concept is. I move from the 19th century and early 20th to the mid-20th century with Arthur C. Clarke. Again, I referred to him in the previous episode, my listener Q&A, episode 156. I mentioned him being the co-author of 2001, A Space Odyssey, the movie, of course co-authoring with Stanley Kubrick, and of course wholly responsible for the novel. The two were written concurrently, which I find really interesting. The book and the film don't wholly align, but they do interweave in really interesting ways, and I am still pondering the question, is it better to read the book first than watch the film, or watch the film and then read the book? Because, as I say, they were written together. Arthur C. Clarke is, of course, one of the big three of sci-fi writers, especially in the 1950s and 60s, along with Isaac Asimov, who wrote The Rules of Robotics. I think that kind of formed the movie I, Robot, and Robert A. Heinlein, who wrote Starship Troopers. In both cases, I would say, never judge a book by its movie. But I think 2001 A Space Odyssey is pretty accurate. And actually, 2010, the year we make contact, I think it is one of the most underrated sci-fi films out there. I thought it was really good. Completely different from 2001. Just as intermittently Arthur C. Clarke would churn out another in his kind of year series. I spent some time looking at the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation, and I really enjoyed their biography of him, because I know his sci-fi work pretty well, and if you want to see a modern version, then Christopher Nolan's sci-fi film Interstellar actually took a huge amount from Arthur C. Clarke, including certain, I think, scenes and shots just made me think of his stories, so I really enjoyed it. Anyway, looking at the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation, here's their biography. Arthur Charles Clarke was born to an English farming family in the seaside town of Minehead in the county of Somerset in the southwestern England on December the 16th, 1917. As a child, he enjoyed stargazing and reading American science fiction magazines, which sparked his lifelong enthusiasm for space sciences. Again, just leaning in here to say I find it really interesting, the American influence on British sci-fi. After moving to London in 1936, Clarke was able to pursue his interest further by joining the British Interplanetary Society, the BIS. He worked with astronautic material in the society, contributed to the BIS Bulletin, and began writing science fiction. After World War II erupted in 1939, Arthur Clarke joined the Royal Air Force and served as a radar instructor and technician from 1941 to 1946. He was an officer in charge of the first radar talk-down equipment, the ground-controlled approach. During its experimental trials, the technique is used by aircraft control to guide aircraft to a safe landing based on radar images during inclement weather. Clarke's only non-science fiction novel, Glide Path, was based on his experiences in this project. After the war, Clarke returned to London. He was awarded a fellowship at King's College London, where he obtained a first-class honours degree in physics and mathematics in 1948. He also returned to the British Interplanetary Society and served as the Society's president 1946 to 47 and 51 to 53. Clarke moved to Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon, in 1956, largely to pursue his interest in underwater exploration along the country's coast, as well as on Australia's Great Barrier Reef. He lived first in the coastal city of Unawatuna, and then Colombo, Sri Lanka's largest city. In 1962, Clarke was diagnosed with polio, which reduced his diving activities. In 1988, he was diagnosed with post-polio syndrome and was largely confined to a wheelchair until he passed away at the age of 90 on March the 19th, 2008. Arthur Clarke's remarkable lifetime work was recognised by both the country of his birth and his adopted home country in 1988. Queen Elizabeth II honoured Clarke with a knighthood formally conferred by Prince Charles in Sri Lanka 2 years later. In 2005, Clarke was awarded a Sri Lanka Bhimanya, the pride of Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka's highest civilian honour. Now, I read this in the previous sci-fi episode, but I think it's a quote worth repeating. Every revolutionary idea seems to evoke 3 stages of reaction. They may be summed up by the phrases 1, it's completely impossible, 2, it's possible but not worth doing, 3, I said it was a good idea all along. He also said 2 possibilities exist. Either we are alone in the universe or we are not. Both are equally terrifying. It was kind of around this era, the 1960s, that we get the Gerry Anderson era on television, especially with Thunderbirds and Space 1999. I talked about Thunderbirds with British Bond addict Chris, who is now based in the United States. He guided me through the complete Thunderbirds in a previous episode. Space 1999 I referred to on my YouTube video all about how British is Star Wars, as there's a bit of a link. I've also previously talked about Doctor Who in 3 episodes with my good friend Daniel Gaster. Thank you very much to him for giving me an insight I didn't previously have, especially into classic Who, as it previously it started in the 60s with a kind of grandfather-grandchild relationship, very much leaning into the BBC's kind of idea to educate, inform and entertain, and now of course it's a very, very modern, contemporary drama, and it's interesting to see how it's evolved. By the way, that video on Star Wars, I did get a few messages from people saying that in Star Wars, British people are the villains and Americans the heroes, which is something that Ivan Kershner rarely came out with. In the original Star Wars film, it wasn't something rarely considered by George Lucas. Kershner, for The Empire Strikes Back, came in and suggested this, and Lucas liked the idea because then it was a bit more like the sword and sandal epics, in which you have the Romans are all British accented, and the heroes, especially say Spartacus, have American accents, but it never quite works in Star Wars. In fact, you could argue it doesn't work in films generally, and Dr. Jeff Lindsay on YouTube has a brilliant video all about this, breaking it down, specifically saying, well, if you want a villain, then yes, received pronunciation is it, but that's not a British accent as such, it's a very specific one, which is also Obi-Wan Kenobi's accent. But he needs to be a man of authority, so he speaks the Queen's English, as much as Grand Moff Tarkin. Equally, many of the Imperials have American accents, but that's largely logistics and who dubbed who. And, of course, Richard McQuant directed Return of the Jedi. So then you have a British director, a Welsh director, I should say, who then kind of adds a different dynamic. And, of course, the prequels were filmed in Australia. So then you have all kinds of Australian and New Zealand accents fitted in, but my recommended rabbit hole on British accents would actually be Dr. Jeff Lindsay on YouTube, easy to find, and he has a few videos on, well, do movie villains have British accents, and I think his depth of understanding is really good here. Of course, all the heroes have British accents in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, created by Douglas Adams, again briefly covered in the previous episode, but I just wanted to say a little bit more, because I'm a big fan of it. I'm a fan of the original Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the BBC Radio 4 drama that came out in 1978. I have read many times the book, which came out the following year, 1979. I've recently seen the TV show, the original one, which was 1981, the first episode, and I've had a bit of a look into the first video game, 1984, and Starship Titanic in 1997, which is mentioned in the third Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy book. There were further radio shows in 2004, 2005, and of course there's the movie in 2005 with Martin Freeman. The interesting thing about all of these is that none of them are consistent with each other. They are all really different, and indeed the movie version probably leans into other versions of it more than any of the previous ones did, because Douglas Adams had, I believe, passed away by this point, so they really wanted to take that, including one of the ideas that never made it into a previous version, that he was determined to get into a movie. He'd long wanted a movie. Anyway, I find it fascinating how different he makes all of them. He was, at one point, a Doctor Who writer. He later came out with this fantastic book, Dirk Gently, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, and the sequel, The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul. I see this listed with sci-fi, and specifically as I'm more keen on the sequel, The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul, I do wonder, is this sci-fi or fantasy? It could be one or the other. Reputedly, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency by Douglas Adams was based on an abandoned Doctor Who script that he wrote for the Tom Baker era, which may explain some of the vibe of the first book. Anyway, I do enjoy this, and these two books are really good. The Salmon of Doubt is kind of the published final versions of his third draft, which he died whilst he was working on it. But it's also been adapted a few times. There's an Elijah Wood version, which I saw on Netflix. 2006, that series is quite dark and also very close to one of the books. Not a straight adaptation at all, but it's got loads of weird little ideas from it and lots of the spirit. The second series in 2017 I didn't find quite as compelling as the first. I was then surprised to discover there's a BBC version with Stephen Mangan and Darren Boyd from 2010 to 2012. The main character is made much more likeable. It's got Stephen Mangan's likeability far more than any of the other versions. And of course, there is a BBC Radio 4 series, first broadcast in 2007, which featured the comedian Harry Enfield, Billy Boyd, who is Pippin in Lord of the Rings, and Olivia Colman, who is everywhere. This version involves a time machine as one of its central MacGuffins, and so is naturally a bit more sci-fi, I think, than the others. Maybe the Elijah Wood has a bit of sci-fi going as well. Anyway, I would recommend the books, but I think the Elijah Wood one is alright as well. As I slowly draw to a close, I have to mention, because I'm in the Facebook group Britain, People, Places and Pastimes, and the lady there suggested that I really need to cover the Quatermass Experiment, which I have to admit I have never seen. It's a 1950s BBC TV show. Most of the episodes are lost, but there were Hammer movie adaptations, as in the Hammer horror people, but it's a precursor to and an influence upon Doctor Who 2001. Mild-mannered scientist who takes on alien threats and moral dilemmas, but even ardent fans do note, and there are websites dedicated to this, that there are amateurish performances, silly effects and so on, but it's very much the spirit of the age, and this 1950s series, the Quatermass Experiment, walked so its successors could run. I also know a few people who have very happy childhood memories of The Tomorrow People, which came out in 1973. Most of them have such happy childhood memories they refuse to watch it as an adult just in case it gets spoiled. But anyway, all versions of the show concerns the emergence of the next stage of human evolution, known colloquially as the Tomorrow People, born to human parents. These apparently normal children are, at some point between childhood and late adolescence, they experience a process called breaking out as they develop special paranormal activities such as telepathy, telekinesis, teleportation, but their psychological makeup prevents them from intentionally killing others. Kind of an X-Men kind of setup, I suppose, but without the school and without the killing. And of course, very popular, Blake's 7, an almost immediate response to Star Wars 1978 to 1981. Blake's 7 was watched by approximately 10 million people in the UK and was broadcast in 25 other countries. How many humans in it? Well, 6, and the 7th is the computer. It was created by Terry Nation, who's the creator of the Daleks and Doctor Who, and pitched this as the Dirty Dozen in space. And I vaguely recall the main villain is a woman! Very progressive. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that quick run-through of British science fiction, and if there's any I missed, then you can contact me on Instagram at FlemingNeverDies, or just send me an email, albionneverdies@gmail.com. I hope you enjoyed it. Often I get suggestions for topics I would like to cover, and sometimes I just don't have enough time in the moment, but I do like to cycle back. So here's one that I covered for a minute in another podcast, but I thought it deserved a podcast all of its own. So thank you very much. Is he ready? Goes Bond on Instagram, and thank you for listening. Goodbye.